Hello, young scholars. Welcome to yet another podcast on various topics in AP, World, and European history. And I am sorry to say that this one will largely be a relatively depressing and unpleasant one, I have to say. The subject, of course, as you can see, is the interbellum. That is the period between the two world wars from approximately 1919 to about 1939. Now, you will recall that when we left Europe, World War One had been ended by an armistice, and parts of Europe were pretty badly devastated. Northeastern France, in particular, where the Western Front ran, and where the bulk of the fighting was done, but also parts of Russia, parts of the Balkans, and so forth and so on. You have a lot of damaged towns. You see here a photo which was later sort of recolored, showing the damage from artillery shelling and from bombing. You also have a lot of damaged infrastructure like rail lines and that kind of thing, a lot of farmland that's been destroyed, and all over Europe, particularly in France, but certainly in Germany and Britain and other countries as well. You have a lot of widows that are in mourning. You have a lot of orphan children. You have a lot of disillusioned soldiers who, you'll recall, in 1914 sort of left for this grand adventure and came home certainly having lost their innocence, and in many cases also having lost various limbs and so forth and so on. So it turned out to be a pretty nasty business. Now, to add insult to injury, most of the European economies, the major European economies, were in shambles. We talked about the fact that in 1917, 1918, in a number of the belligerent nations, food was in short supply and other consumer goods were being rationed, or in some cases could not be had at all. And at the same time, we have the collapse of a number of empires. The German Empire is in the midst of dealing with a revolt. Certainly the former Romanov Russian Empire is now deep in a civil war. And also the Turkish and Austro-Hungarian empires have finally fallen apart as well. So in addition to the fact that we have all this economic trouble and suddenly all these people returning from the war, we don't really have strong legal apparatuses in a lot of these places that can meaningfully address those issues. And for those of you who have been with me since the beginning of the course, poor economics and a weak government should look very much to you like a recipe for disaster. Now, some countries actually came out better than others. The United States, in particular, actually, economically speaking, did quite well out of World War I. They had massively increased their industrial production in order to meet the demands of war. And obviously, the United States was spared any direct damage to its population, to its infrastructure, as a result of things like bombing and that sort of thing, the way that Europe has, because obviously the U.S. Had the good sense to go somewhere else to fight its wars. And so as a result, the U.S. really comes onto the world stage in a big way during and after World War I. They went from being a nation that was borrowing money from various Europeans to being the nation that is doing the loaning of said money. A lot of nations, both Allied and Central, at the end of World War I, end up owing the U.S. money. It's a major creditor. I think we can probably look at the U.S. in some ways in this time period, about 1919, 1920, the same way that some economists and political theorists look at China today, a nation that was formerly perhaps sort of a second-rate power, but now is sort of launching itself into that upper strata, becoming economically indispensable, developing a larger political and imperial military power base, that kind of thing. Now, in terms of looking at the end of World War I, we have not yet looked at the Treaty of Versailles, which is absolutely crucial. World War I, of course, had been brought to a close by an armistice that had been signed in November of 1918, But that didn't actually solve any of the issues at stake. Really, all it had done was get everybody to stop shooting at each other. So it was time in 1919 for everybody to actually sit down at the table and write up a treaty, and they decided to do that at Versailles. You will doubtless recall that Versailles was a palace complex that was built uh, outside of Paris, and it had been the residence of a number of the Bourbon French monarchs prior to the French Revolution. And obviously, it's a nice building. It's big. It's got a lot of space. It's got a lot of rooms to put people, and so it's a very convenient place to have something like a peace conference. Now, at Versailles, we have a couple of interesting things going on that end up forcing the treaty in a very specific direction. The Allies, by and large, considered themselves victorious, even though they hadn't managed to invade and conquer Germany. And the Central Powers really couldn't manage a particularly effective resistance at the peace conference, because you will recall all three of the Central Powers, that is Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the Ottoman Turkish Empire, were all basically in the middle of a revolution. So their government was not providing a great deal of stability. They weren't necessarily able to provide their diplomats with particularly clear instructions. Certainly their heads of state were not available to go to the conference to try and address these things. And so the Allies were able to kind of bully their way through it. And the Big Four, the so-called Big Four, who really dominated the conference, were the heads of state of the main Allied nations. That is to say, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, who was the Prime Minister of Italy at the time, David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Georges Clemenceau, who you see pictured here, who you will recall he came to power in France in the wake of the Dreyfus Affair, and then Woodrow Wilson, who is the President of the United States. The United States, of course, having come into the end of the war and having been, certainly in its own mind, instrumental in ensuring this quote-unquote Allied victory. Now, the problem is, even everybody at the peace conference doesn't necessarily come to the table with the same ends in mind. Woodrow Wilson, who was a pretty idealistic American president, basically wanted to ensure that a war like this would never happen again. And to that end, he came to the treaty with sort of the intent of building some sort of mechanism for international cooperation and peace. And he composed what he called 14 points. You know, this list of 14 things that he was really concerned about making sure got accomplished at this treaty. It is not, for our purposes, necessary to know them all, but you do need to know that most of the things that he recommends are things that would have addressed the kinds of things that led to World War I in the first place. He wants open treaties so that nobody is making these sort of secret treaties that countries like France and Britain and Russia were making with each other. Everybody knows who's allied with who, and it'll be a lot just sort of clearer that way, and nobody will be able to convince themselves that they can go to war and win, because they'll know sort of who's allied with who. He also wanted to establish this principle of self-determination, which was that people in these various states, rather than being dominated by a colonial power, particularly in groups that had a distinct sort of ethnic nationality of some kind, that those people should be able to determine what form of government they wanted to have, determine what they sort of want to do in terms of ruling themselves, what kind of government they should have. That was all tied up in self-determination. And then perhaps most importantly, he wanted to establish a League of Nations, an organization of nations that would give them some kind of an opportunity to meet together and to work together to prevent war. So the idea being that, you know, if we had ambassadors from Germany and Austria and France and Serbia and Russia and Great Britain in 1914 all sitting together at the same place working this stuff out, maybe we wouldn't have spent the last 4 years killing each other. And Wilson is so is so stringent in arguing for these things, in part because he's really going to argue that this notion of the balance of power that has been arguably one of the prevailing forces in European foreign relations since the Treaty of Lodi is really dead. And he's going to say, World War One proved that. You guys thought that you had this balance of power that was going to ensure peace and stability, and it ended up getting 75 million people killed. That shows that this doesn't work anymore. We've got to try something else. So that's Woodrow Wilson. Meanwhile, Georges Clemenceau, who was called the Tiger, is really kind of looking to put a hurt on Germany. He seems to have recognized that a very punitive peace settlement was going to be a problem, but his people back in France were very, very afraid of a strong Germany. They had lost the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and obviously they had spent the last 4 years being pounded by German artillery and poison gas and bombed from the air and that kind of thing. And so Clemenceau felt like he was in a position that he had to go back to the French people, showing that he had caused Germany to have to sort of back down so that they would be safe. Germany, of course, you will recall, was more industrialized than France and had a larger population, and so therefore, the French certainly had reason to be concerned. So therefore, Clemenceau really goes into the conference demanding that, first of all, Germany's military strength be reduced, and second of all, that the French be allowed to occupy sort of industrial territories in the Rhine region until Germany could pay war reparations to the French, which you will recall the Germans, in fact, set a precedent for when they occupied Alsace-Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War. So while Wilson is sort of campaigning for this idealistic international peace, Clemenceau wants to sort of punish Germany. Britain is a little bit more flexible. Britain isn't super interested in seeing Germany get ruined, because Germany is a potentially very economically strong trade partner. And with this sort of looming Soviet communist threat beginning to rise in Russia, a strong Germany could have been sort of a bulwark to protect Western Europe against some kind of international communist uprising, which David Lloyd George was beginning to be quite concerned about. Italy, meanwhile, is less concerned about either of those things. Italy really wants to make sure that they come out of the treaty with the opportunity to have annexed a number of these sort of former Austrian territories. We know that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is about to get broken up. Let's see how much we can get out of the deal. Okay, so once the treaty is written, and it takes a period of several months, a couple of things come out. Number one, there is a war guilt clause that is written in, by which Germany is forced to accept the blame for having started the war, which we are firmly aware is not necessarily the case, and also had to assume responsibility to pay back the Allies for all of their damages, both in terms of loss of life and also in terms of damage to infrastructure and farms and economic and so forth, which amounted to billions upon billions of dollars, as we discussed in a previous lecture. So France then was also going to receive back Alsace-Lorraine and was going to be able to occupy the German side of the Rhine for 15 years. And then after that 15-year period was up, the area was to be permanently demilitarized. So in the name of trying to ensure peace, neither France nor Germany is ever allowed to keep troops in this region along the Rhine River. They also went ahead and carved out a new independent Poland, which for the Poles was a pleasant surprise. You will recall that Poland last lost its independence in the 1790s when it was carved up by Austria, the Austrian Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns in Prussia. And Germany, along with sort of Clemenceau's call, is forced to reduce the strength of its military. Germany is allowed to have 100,000 soldiers and 12 warships. they are permitted no submarines and no aircraft. So essentially, what they did is they reduced what had been one of the strongest militaries in Europe to basically a glorified police force. There's really not a great deal that Germany could do to be effective in a conflict with so small an army. Germany's war reparations, and these are extraordinary. They were quite shocking. Um, they were expected to pay 132 billion marks. They were expected to give up their entire merchant fleet and large sections of their fishing fleet to the Allies. All the stock in their railroad companies was to go to the Allies. They had to give up 1/4 of their coal production to the Allies, and perhaps most significantly, well, perhaps no, not most significantly, but certainly the real, the real sort of twisting the knife was that they were required to use their shipyards to build ships for the Allies for free. So not only are they being forced to pay, they're really, in a lot of ways, being robbed of their economic livelihood. And this, when it was declared, led to incredible outrage in Germany, and in some cases elsewhere. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who we'll actually talk about again in a moment because he's quite important, particularly in the era in which we are now living. He was a member of the peace delegation, and he walked out and basically quit in protest. And he said, if we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. So he argued very sternly that, if you guys do this, you're asking for trouble, a couple decades down the road. And of course, he ended up being absolutely correct. Furthermore, we will find, I think, that Germany is actually going to end up not paying most of her reparations because realistically, she couldn't. Germany was economically devastated at the end of the war, and so what in fact ends up happening is Germany ends up taking on a lot of loans from the Allied countries instead of paying back the money that she's owed. But we'll get there in a little bit. Couple other things that we need to make note of in the treaty. Austria, as you see, is severely reduced in size. Austria used to include all this territory in here. Austria is now just right here. They established an independent Czech Republic, which certainly our Bohemians going all the way back to the 30 Years' War had been advocating for. They also create an independent Hungary and independent Yugoslavia. They give a lot of territory to Romania and to Poland. And then the Ottoman Empire, which is here and then sort of down over here in the Middle East, is also sort of chopped up, but far from granting the independence that the British promised to some of these groups like the Arabs. They divide and dismember the empire into these so-called mandates, which is basically a nice word for colony. France is going to take control of Syria and Lebanon. The United Kingdom is going to get Saudi Arabia and the area that are today known as Palestine or Israel, and the Greeks and Italians are going to occupy parts of Turkey. Now, interestingly enough, what is going to happen is, as the Greeks and Italians are occupying Turkey, the Turks are going to revolt under a gentleman named Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who is also known as Ataturk. And he is going to sort of fight to kick them out. And in 1923, he is going to establish Turkey as essentially a secular republic, and it's going to function more or less consistently down into the present day. And Ataturk, in many ways, is continuing the work that the Young Turks started before the war and were continuing through the war. He's separating church and state. He forbids the wearing of the traditional Turkish hat, the fez. He establishes a compulsory education system. He encourages westernization, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, we should also note that and again, it's not on our map here, but down here in Palestine, the British have another difficulty brewing, which is they promised these Arab Palestinians independence in exchange for their assistance against the Turk. But in 1917, they wrote up the so-called Balfour Declaration, which also declared that they intended to establish some kind of a a Jewish homeland, if not a full-on Jewish state in that part of the world. And so there are basically two groups of people who are standing there waiting for the British to keep their word, and as you are doubtless aware, that continues to be a source of some confusion and conflict into the present day. So anyway, getting back to the Treaty of Versailles, we talked about the fact that Germany is facing all these reparations. It has lost some territory. In fact, East Prussia is kind of split off. It's still controlled by Germany, but it's separated by these Polish territories. Austria-Hungary is broken up into a new sort of group of successor states. And just as a sign of really what we're looking at here politically, in 1914, there were 14 currencies in Europe. In 1919, there are 27. So we're talking about almost doubling the number of countries in Europe. And in spite of the fact that they did this and attempted to do so at least more or less along ethnic and cultural lines, which certainly was a big step up from the Berlin Conference of 1884, there is still a lot of states, particularly in the Balkans, in this area, that are multi-ethnic, that are multi-religious. You will notice that Russia has not been mentioned at all, and that is because Russia was completely excluded from the peace conference. First of all, Russia was still involved in its own civil war, and again, was kind of busy doing its own thing, couldn't really bring any kind of a unified response to the table. But beyond that, the Western allies felt like, you know, the Russians betrayed us, they left us hanging, they got out of the war early, and therefore they do not get to have any part in making the peace settlement. That is also being fueled by the fact that most of the Western powers really distrusted communism and certainly distrusted Vladimir Lenin. They saw him as this sort of crazy leftist revolutionary. And incidentally, all of the major allies, Britain, France, America, had all sent troops and weapons to help fight against the communists in the Civil War. So even though we're wrapping up the war in Europe, we're also, in some cases, putting small numbers of troops into Russia. Okay. You may also be aware that Wilson, after having fought so hard to ensure that this League of Nations would be created out of the Versailles Treaty and try to ensure self-determination and the 14 points and all that stuff, went home to find that in his absence they had had elections and that the Republicans had won a number of seats in Congress. And the Republicans at the time were largely isolationists and did not want to be involved in the affairs of other countries. They sort of argued that World War I had been this big mess that they shouldn't have gotten into. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson's own country refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They did not accept it, and they ended up making separate pieces with everybody else. A couple of nods that we need to make to what is going on elsewhere in the world. Despite the fact that Wilson touted this war as a war to sort of preserve democracy, we still see a great deal of imperialism and colonialism going on. The peace treaty did not really address nationalism for anybody outside of Europe, and so many of those groups during this period, as the ideas of the Enlightenment are continuing to spread abroad, are going to start advocating for home rule more loudly. Obviously, in Ireland, that is continuing to happen. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit later about the fact that the Irish are actually going to start militarily working towards some kind of a home rule solution. I have already mentioned the fact that we have this Zionist movement that is attempting to argue in favor of a Jewish state somewhere in the Middle East. And then also T.E. Lawrence and other members of the British military and British government had promised some kind of independence for the Arabs. They're upset about not having gotten that. In India, we have this increasing nationalist sentiment under leaders like Mohandas K. Gandhi and Nehru and Jinnah, some of those cats. During this time, there's actually a protest against British rule in 1919 that leads to the massacre at Amritsar, where the army went in and killed 400 peacefully protesting Indians. And that makes a rather big splash around the world. This is, in fact, the period where we're going to see Gandhi really starting to ramp up some of his work. But obviously, we will not see full independence granted to India until the 1940s. Also, in the wake of the Armenian genocide that was perpetrated by the Turkish military, there is an Armenian independence movement. There is a Persian independence movement. Also in Vietnam, which at this point is still a French colony, there is a young man by the name of Ho Chi Minh who is beginning to become a political activist, who is asking that the French Declaration of the Rights of Man be applied not just in France but also in the colonies. And of course, the French basically just laugh at him and move on with what will eventually be fairly disastrous consequences. In fact, the only real gain in terms of any independence from imperial authority is going to be with the British Commonwealth states. Britain will establish the Commonwealth in 1931 to give some of the bigger colonies like Canada and Australia essentially a form of independence, provided that they continue to operate in cohesion with the British state. That, of course, does not include Ireland. Ireland really starts to get upset with Britain in about 1918 when the British start conscripting the Irish for the war. And really all hell breaks loose. This is when the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, is established amid a great deal of sectarian violence between Catholics and Protestants and a great deal of high unemployment. And in 1920, the British respond by passing the Government of Ireland Act, which creates a Catholic crown colony in the south and keeps the north part of the UK, which is going to foreshadow the eventual split that we still have going today between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But we're not there yet. The fighting is going to continue between the British and the IRA, and the British are actually going to keep 50,000 soldiers in Ireland to keep the peace. Meanwhile, it is also worthwhile to note that Japan is also getting stronger. They're taking on various German territories and Russian territory as well, while the Russians are busy dealing with their revolution and gaining concessions in China. Now, so quick review, just so you can get a sense. Russia loses a lot of its eastern territories that then become independent. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up. Prussia gives up some of its territories. And so this is the sort of setup in Europe that we see after all of that has gone on. We have a number of new countries and so forth and so on. And we also have these mandates over here in the Middle East as well. Now, I mentioned in our last podcast that we were beginning to see a great deal of revolution as people basically got tired of the rising casualty lists and the fact that on the home front they were running out of food and so forth and so on. So in Germany, we have several soldiers' mutinies in late 1918, and people start demanding the Kaiser's abdication. We have a group of socialists who try and rise up in Bavaria and establish a Soviet there. They're ultimately unsuccessful. And the Kaiser finally gives in and agrees to abdicate on the 9th of November 1918. And of course, it is 2 days later that the armistice with the Allies is finally signed. Coincidentally, Kaiser Wilhelm went into exile in Holland and actually continued to live there through the beginning of World War II. He did not die until, I think, 1941, 1942. But he had said that he did not want his body to be taken back to Germany unless the monarchy had been restored, and so he was ultimately buried there. Anyway, that's a complete aside. So after the Kaiser has abdicated and the provisional government has been signed, the armistice has been signed. Germany starts to set up a provisional government. and they start trying to set up a republic. But there's some trouble. First of all, inspired by what's going on in Russia, a number of socialists are attempting to establish Soviets. They're trying to rise up. They're trying to revolt. And in particular, we have a group of sort of socialists in Berlin who are called the Spartacists or Spartakists. They are named after Spartacus, the slave who revolted in ancient Rome. And they start protesting the fact that the army and the police are sort of hunting down and murdering socialists like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. And but unfortunately, at this point, the right wing is still fairly strong in Germany. We still have some monarchists. We still have a rather loyal army. We have a lot of people, old Prussian Junkers and that sort of thing, who still very much believe in the power of the crown and the power of the military. And so we see that the socialists don't really gain a lot of ground. But we should make note of the fact that on both the right and the left, right when the provisional government is established, we already have a great deal of dissatisfaction. They hold their first elections in 1919, and they establish the Weimar Republic. Okay, Weimar, that is actually spelled W-E-I-M-A-R, after a tiny city that they sort of made the new capital, the new legislative center, because it was very centrally located. Things, however, in the Weimar Republic right from the start are really, really not in good shape. First of all, the fact that they are attempting to pay these war reparations and the economy is already in shambles means that they are really, really going deeply, deeply into debt. And in order to attempt to pay that off, they just start printing money. And as I'm sure that you are aware from, going back to the Romans, when we start devaluing our currency and making our money worth less, that's going to cause a lot of trouble. It's going to get so bad, in fact, that people are going to be using German marks, Deutschmarks, as wallpaper. At one point, at sort of the height of this hyperinflation that they're going through, half a pound of apples costs 300 billion German marks. Okay, so obviously everybody's bank accounts become more or less completely worthless. The bonds that Germany issued to help pay for the war cannot be paid back. Wages cannot keep up with the inflation. So you basically aren't making enough to feed yourself at the end of the day. And it's causing a ton of problems. And so it's not going to be until 1925 that the Germans are basically going to be able to get a bunch of American banks to help them kickstart their currency. They're going to stop printing the billion-mark notes. They're going to attempt to drive the inflation down. But at that point, the damage is already done. Things are just going to be really, really rough for Germany all the way through the 20s and getting into the 30s. Meanwhile, in Hungary, Hungary, of course, is broken away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We also have what is initially a mostly unopposed revolution there, and basically a lot of liberals and socialists are saying, okay, listen, they're in the process of writing the Versailles Treaty. We need to make our move now so that we don't get sort of broken off and tacked on to some other country. This is our moment to become independent. And that revolution is basically led by this socialist, or a communist, I should say, named Bela Kun. That's B-E-L-A-K-U-N, space, obviously, in between Bela and Kun. And he wants to take charge and establish a Soviet state, much like was being created in Russia. He attempts to push through some land reforms. He establishes work camps and nationalizes the banks and a number of the industries. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work out. Inflation skyrockets. The currency loses 90% of its value. And he attempts to stave this off by invading Romania, this should all vaguely remind you of the French Revolution. We have this liberal group that comes in. They're having economic problems. They try and jumpstart things with a war. We know that never goes well. So the invasion of Romania fails big time. Kun is overthrown. and he is replaced, and the communists are replaced by a new right-wing Hungarian government under Admiral Miklos Horthy. Pardon me to any Hungarians who know the pronunciation better than I do. I hope I'm pronouncing that as close to correctly as possible. And this right-wing government is going to start attacking Jews because they thought that they were Bolsheviks, and also attacking communists. And they are basically going to try and make sure that when they go to the treaty at Versailles, that Hungary is going to get as fair a shake as possible. Now, we need to leave Europe for a moment, and we need to talk about China. You will recall that in 1900 we had the Boxer Rebellion. The Chinese are upset about the fact that they have lost a great deal of their autonomy and their political and economic ascendancy to the Europeans, who now have these rights of extraterritoriality and so forth in these spheres of influence. And finally, the Manchu ruling dynasty is going to be deposed in 1911. And you'll remember, of course, that this brings an end to about 3,000 years of imperial monarchical rule in China. So in terms of world history, this is a big, big change, okay, 1911. The leading figure in all of this is going to be this gentleman here. His name is Sun Yat-sen. He basically has three overriding principles that he is espousing as he's trying to lead China into this new era. 1, nationalism. 2, democracy. And 3, livelihood. So in other words, we're going to establish ourselves as an independent state. We're going to get rid of all these spheres of influence. We're going to introduce democracy, and we're going to make sure that everybody can make a living, which sound like really fantastic ideas. The army is going to join the rebellion, and Sun Yat-sen is declared the president of this provincial or of this provisional republic. Okay, so Sun Yat-sen is going to be our leader, and he's going to shepherd us through this process of writing a constitution and sort of trying to introduce democracy to this society that has really never known any democracy and all that sort of thing. Which again sounds like a good idea, and really they probably could not have picked anybody better than Sun Yat-sen. He was very well educated. He had formerly been a doctor. He had lived in several different countries. A very worldly guy, right? So again, he was probably a pretty good choice. Unfortunately, while they're trying to get this constitution written, there is a coup, and one of the Chinese generals attempts to establish a military dictatorship because he did not believe that democracy was the thing for China. But unfortunately, it actually falls apart in 1916, and we're actually kind of led into this new warring states period where all these various regions are kind of trying to gain ascendancy. They're kind of being run by warlords and attempting to run themselves autonomously and so forth. And out of all this, we're going to have two big groups, okay? The first is a nationalist party that is initially led by Sun Yat-sen. And I've heard this pronounced a couple of different ways. Some people call it, it's been anglicized, the Kuomintang. A lot of people call it the Kuomintang. Okay, and that is the nationalist party under Sun Yat-sen. And then we have this new group that is starting to gain a lot of traction, and that is the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. Now, those two groups are going to endeavor to work together for a while, and Sun Yat-sen, who was actually pretty well respected by both sides, is able to sort of manage this kind of loose confederacy between the two. But Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and he is replaced in the Kuomintang by a new gentleman named Chiang Kai-shek, who really did not get along very well with the communists. And so what we have is a civil war. And that's going to rage for several years. You can see here. And what we're going to have happen essentially is this civil war in which the Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, the Kuomintang, are being supported by a number of the Western powers, and they almost managed to trap and wipe out the communists in the southern part of the country, but the communists managed to escape and went on this is in 1934, by the way, went on the so-called Long March, in which they literally worked their way sort of all across various parts of China, and lost thousands and thousands of people along the way, um, on their way to sort of escape the persecution of the nationalists. And just when things were looking really bleak for the communists, um, sort of a something happens which sort of they did not see as good, but which in some ways managed to sort of save their tails, and that is the fact that Japan in the mid 1930s starts invading China. And so suddenly the nationalists and the communists both are forced to turn their attention towards working together to deal with this Japanese invasion before they can go back to killing each other. And this is when the CCP is really going to start turning things around. Despite not having some of that Western support that the Kuomintang has, the CCP is going to do a better job of defending their people against the Japanese, largely by fighting a guerrilla-style war. They're also going to do a better job of developing civil society, giving the peasants a voice in the government, and sort of ensuring stability in the region. And so ultimately they are going to be able to triumph. And of course we will see the establishment of a Chinese communist state. But that's not quite here yet. So I want to set that aside for a minute. We'll return to Europe. So back to Europe, or perhaps better to say back to the Western world. Now, in the West, the decade of the 1920s is sometimes referred to as the Roaring Twenties because particularly after World War I, the 20s were a welcome change. Obviously, we have a lot of new technology that is coming into play. The automobile by this point has become much more affordable, particularly with the development of assembly lines to produce automobiles, people like Henry Ford in the United States. And so a lot more middle class people are going to be able to afford cars. Also, radio is becoming a major medium, both for the dissemination of information, news and that sort of thing, but also for doing things like playing popular music, which up to this point has not been possible unless you had a record player in your house, and certainly it couldn't be broadcast over distance. Also, film is beginning to develop as a medium as well, and that's going to grow a great deal in the 30s, obviously, particularly when we are able to put sound with film, the development of the so-called talkies as opposed to silent film. This is also a period during which there is a great deal of sort of increased liberalism with regard to entertainment, and a lot of what some people are going to call sort of hedonism. A lot of women are going to begin cutting their hair short and wearing these dresses without bloomers, exposing their legs, God forbid, and all that sort of thing. There is a prevailing sense that we lived through the Great War. We should just be happy to not be getting shot at. Let's go out and have a good time, particularly in the United States. And in the United States, in spite of the fact that alcohol is made illegal in the early 20s, a lot of people are drinking anyway. That's going to fuel the development of organized crime. And we're really going to see that everybody's really sort of managing to enjoy themselves despite that prohibition. In Europe, obviously, things are not quite as financially stable, so things can't be quite as raucous generally, but there is going to be a lot more people trying to get back to business as usual, being involved in sports, going to dances, and that kind of thing. And again, the cars and the radio and are fueling all of that. We'll talk more about some of that in a moment. Now, we need to talk about the big problem, right, that we haven't really addressed, and that is inflation and unemployment. All the European governments, especially Germany, obviously, had borrowed tons of money to pay for the war, and in order to pay that off after the war, they have to start printing money. So, generally speaking, in Europe, bank accounts are going to lose 85% of their value from 1913 to 1929, which is just an extraordinary change. because that is also going to contribute to high unemployment, and you can see, obviously during the war years it drops very sharply, but then immediately after the war, huge spikes in unemployment. This is in Britain, but we see the same trend largely across Europe. Because of the high unemployment, we're going to have continued worker protests, particularly with the inspiration that's being provided by the Russians. We are going to see continued sort of these little veins of socialism that are going to be running through some of the working classes in Western Europe. And there are a small number of individuals who did really, really well during the war, selling munitions and that sort of thing, who rack up these huge profits, but most everybody else is doing badly. So the unemployment is relatively high. You can also see here the almost exponential curve on which for the 4 years after the war, the German mark devalued itself. And then here you see various images from Germany. We have a gentleman with a wheelbarrow full of money going to buy some bread. We have a bunch of stacks of money that have been tied together to make blocks that these kids are playing with. We have a woman here stoking her fire with Deutschmarks. So the economic situation in some circles was pretty bad. And obviously, when you have economic trouble, it follows that you are also going to have social turmoil. By now, most of our European countries have universal male suffrage. The problem is, in a lot of cases, you will recall that the elites, the aristocracy, whether you're looking at Germany or Britain or other places as well, have not really surrendered full control of the government to these elected bodies. And so they're really starting to sort of butt heads. In Britain, for example, you still have a very concentrated aristocracy. You have about 1% of the population controlling about 60% of the wealth. Which for those of you who have ever watched any Downton Abbey, or if you've ever had a chance to see a miniseries called Brideshead Revisited, don't watch the new film, go back and watch the one from 1981. Then I think you have some idea of this split that we have, and the fact that in some cases the British aristocracy is still attempting to live this very charmed lifestyle, when in reality that it has sort of gone away as industrialization and the realities of post-war life have changed. There is, however, much as after Napoleon, there's a big conservative reaction after World War I, and that's largely motivated by two factors. One is the Red Scare, this fear that unless we vote the conservatives into power, somehow communism is going to spread into Western Europe. And then also the return of a number of these soldiers home from the war. Many of them are going to be voting conservative as well. Now, in Britain, in 1926, in response to the fact that we have this sort of headbutting between the working classes and the aristocracy, that sort of Disraelian unity in the Tory party has kind of broken down. In 1926, we're going to have a general strike. All kinds of workers, hundreds of thousands of them, are going to walk off the job, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. And actually, ironically perhaps, the British middle and upper classes are really going to rally together when this happens. Students from Cambridge and Oxford and sort of sons of the aristocracy are going to jump into place almost to sort of fill the gap in the emergency, and they're going to basically run the phones and the delivery services and a lot of the sort of essential businesses while these workers are on strike. And because the aristocracy, believe it or not, is able to sort of respond and keep things running without the working classes, the working class eventually just kind of has to give up and go back to work without having necessarily gained much. We have some of the same patterns in France. The conservatives do very well after the war. But we are going to have a lot of financial trouble in the middle of the 20s. Also, in all of these countries in Europe, women are advocating for the vote more strongly. After the war, in Britain, they're going to be allowed to vote in 1918. In America, it won't come until 1919. But in spite of that, this is not going to be the sort of broad victory for feminism that it is sometimes portrayed as. Most women after the war are going to go back home and go back to being sort of Susie homemaker and that kind of thing. They don't stay in the workforce. All that said, however, Britain and France, in many cases, are going to be sort of the calm center of the European universe during this period. They're going to be maintaining relatively conservative republics. They're going to be trying to deal with strikes from the lower classes. You do have something of an expanding communist party in France, not so much in Britain, but in both cases, they're going to respond to increased demand by the workers, much in the same way that Otto von Bismarck did. We're going to establish welfare states. We're going to start providing public housing, education, pensions for war widows and orphans, insurance for workers, and that's really going to sort of take the steam out of the communist movement. Because people were not, in my opinion, generally attracted to the Communist Party because they wanted this glorious workers' revolution. They did it because they wanted stability and support. And so once that stability and support has been provided, there doesn't seem to be a great need for communism. We need to talk a little bit about what's going on in art during this period. And the first thing I want to mention is sort of Dadaism. Dadaism starts to crop up actually during the war, and it is a direct response to sort of the absurdity of World War I, the fact that all these people are being killed seemingly for no reason. And so Dadaism is motivated by a certain sense of absurdity. Let's paint things that are ridiculous. Let's experiment. Let's break the conventions. And so we have people doing things like painting mustaches on Mona Lisas and putting together these sort of bizarre collages and that kind of thing. Okay. We also have a surrealist movement doing things like "This is not a pipe," which is a picture of a pipe. This bizarre image of, well, goodness, various things. We'll take a look at a lot of these in class, so I don't want to dwell on them overly much here, just to point out that they exist. Obviously, the very famous Dali image, Persistence of Memory, from the early 1930s. We also have a Cubist and abstract movement, which in some ways is being led by Picasso. You'll notice in some ways we're continuing the work that the Surrealists and even the Impressionists started, because we have photography and now also film, motion picture. We're getting away from something that we can scientifically portray. We want to create an image of something that the human eye could not normally be exposed to. Same thing here with Picasso's Guernica, and we're going to come back to this image in a moment, so I won't dwell on it overly much here. Also, Marc Chagall, the green violinist, continued exploration of Cubism and abstractism. Marcel Duchamp, Nude Descending a Staircase, which last time I did this with a group of students, we spent a great deal of time looking for the woman, woman or man, I suppose, the nude, and found him or her in a number of different places. I'll let you interpret that for yourself. This quote by Duchamp, I think, really gives us a sense of what it is that these sort of abstract artists are going for, right? I mean, we are searching for new meaning. In an era when nationalism and imperialism and liberalism, these notions to which we clung throughout the back half of the 19th century, in an era when those no longer have the meaning that we thought they did, we have to find something else. And so what a lot of these abstract painters are doing is producing something that can be interpreted. They are continuing to search for that new meaning and hopefully allowing their audience to find some of the meaning that they may be searching for as well. Here is, of course, another example. And then another image of the Salvador Dali. We also need to talk briefly about what's going on in music. This is a period when a couple of really interesting things are happening. First of all, jazz is invented in the teens, or maybe discovered would be a better way to put it. Jazz is, generally speaking, the use of what are traditionally African and African American musical styles on European instruments. So take elements of African music like swing and polyrhythms and syncopation that were not very common in sort of classical and romantic European musical literature. We perform those elements on trumpets and clarinets and pianos and so forth, to get this sort of bizarre musical fusion of African and European, and create really a very distinctive art form. And of course, from jazz, we will eventually get a number of other forms, R&B, rock, metal, and so forth and so on. Now, this is not just being performed by black musicians. Obviously, a lot of our early sort of jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway and some of those cats, Ella Fitzgerald, are crucial. But even as the art form spreads into Europe, we see people beginning to write jazz symphonies. In fact, some of the Russian composers, of all things, were writing these sort of jazz symphonies where they're continuing to sort of fuse these new stylings with more traditional European art forms and that kind of thing. We even have the writing of Porgy and Bess, which is kind of a jazz opera of a sort, about these sort of down on their luck African Americans living in the South. Okay. This is what is called the big band era, which is in many ways kind of a misnomer, because obviously during this period we have finally discovered two really important sort of new tools when it comes to disseminating music. One, we have recording technology. So we can now, and technically this came along in the real late 19th century, but we can now record a person or a group of people performing music. We can put it onto a record and or play it on the radio, and then we can sort of ship it out to people that way. So you do not have to necessarily experience the music live anymore. But the other thing that we've done, and this is part and parcel with the notion of recording, is we've also figured out how to amplify. We've discovered amplification, which means we can now have a relatively small group of musicians playing in a concert hall or in a dance hall. And in some cases, we can electronically project the sound that they are producing towards the audience. So, for example, we have the development of the microphone, which allows a singer to do a lot of things that could previously not be heard in a large hall. You know, right? We have opera singers, obviously, but there are only certain ways that they are able to sing, certain volumes that they're able to sing at that are able to project. And so this big band era, we're actually going to see, rather than these huge, in some case, 100-piece orchestras with choirs and so forth, you can have a group of 15 or 20 musicians who can really put out a ton of sound, and can really play some music that's going to get a dance hall sort of jumping and that kind of thing. So it's a really neat era. It's an era where a ton of musical innovation is happening, and we'll take some time to explore that a little bit in class. In terms of literature, again, it is also an era where the old forms no longer hold true, where people are beginning to experiment. In a lot of ways, this is really driven by World War I, especially this notion of cynicism and irony. Okay, cynicism in that we went off thinking that the war was going to be this great adventure. We've come home to find that not only was it not the adventure that we hoped for, but in our absence, our countries have been ruined by this war. All of our friends are dead. And so this notion of, no matter what happens, I know it's going to turn out bad. You see a lot of that kind of cynicism in some of the writings of Hemingway and other various writers from the war period. George Orwell is another one. And if any of you have not read To Shoot an Elephant, which is an Orwellian I guess semi-true story about his experiences as a colonial administrator in the Far East, I strongly recommend it. Also, irony, this notion that we didn't get what we expected, and that kind of thing also comes from the war. In fact, there are some works that are done about men sort of going to the war and then losing various limbs or other body parts and coming back and feeling like they're no longer a man, and so this thing that was supposed to bring them their manhood has in fact taken their manhood away, that kind of thing. Okay. We also see the development of stream of consciousness writing, particularly with a guy named James Joyce, who is well, I guess an Irish writer. He writes a novel called Ulysses, which was actually banned in a number of countries because there's some fairly racy sexuality in it. And some of this is also being influenced by the work of people like Sigmund Freud and Nietzsche, these guys who have started to sort of look at human cognition in different ways, who have started to bend some of the rules in terms of how we look at our own thinking and that kind of thing. So moving on, we have to talk about fascism. No discussion of what's going on in Europe in the 20s and 30s would be complete without it. What is fascism? Well, fascism is a philosophy that generally, and this is a quote, struggles to reinforce unity, energy, and the purity of national groups. It is generally seen as a form of socialism. So it is what in America today we would call "quote unquote" big government. Generally, it is a command economy. But make sure that you do not confuse this notion of fascist socialism with communism. Okay, all of the fascists were far right. Okay, they are vehement anti-communists, every single one of them. Okay, I have students every year who talk about Hitler as a communist. Okay, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, none of those guys were communists. They hated communism, in fact, because it focused on the unity of a group of individuals in terms of their class, right? Remember, it's a working class movement, and it's supposed to be international. Nationalism, of course, is a key facet of fascism. You can't have fascism without this notion of a nation state, and so any kind of internationalism is bad for that notion. Also, fascism is predicated on continual struggle. The idea that a nation must continually fight to expand, that it must continually sort of struggle to strengthen itself, and this is also incompatible with communism because the whole notion of communism is corporatism, cooperation, and so forth and so on. So make sure you don't get those two confused. Now, in terms of fascism, we need to ask, okay, where does this come from? Because all of a sudden this philosophy sort of comes out of nowhere after World War I, and we find all of these countries adopting it. Well, I would tender that it comes from a couple of places. There are a lot of trends that we've seen in sort of previous European societies that are going to lead us in this direction in some way. One, this notion of imperial militarism and the nationalism that came along with that we saw in World War I. This idea that we must keep the country strong, we have to maintain these colonies, we need to expand, so forth and so on. Also, this notion of the Bismarckian welfare state. Okay, we're going to make sure we're conservatives, so we're not going to go really liberal. We're going to maintain tight control over the state, but in order to ensure order and sort of effective work, we're going to make sure that everybody is taken care of. We're going to provide the pensions and so forth and so on. Also, this notion of capitalism, which you remember, capitalism ties in very nicely with the notion of struggling for survival, right? The good businesses, the effective, efficient businesses get stronger and absorb more of the market share. The weak businesses are destroyed, and so people in some ways are going to see the nation state the same way. And then commensurate with that, the notion of social Darwinism. Our national group is superior. We are better. That is particularly going to be a facet of policy in fascist Germany. And then finally, this notion of socialism, this idea that the government should step in some way to sort of moderate the economy to make sure that everybody is taken care of in some way. So what that is going to result in then is this notion of fascism, this idea that the national group, A, should be unified, and B, should continuously struggle to strengthen itself and to expand itself and keep the race strong. At one point, Adolf Hitler in a speech said something to the effect of, for many years we've had these wars and these struggles with outside powers to weed out sort of our weak, right? Like those of us who are not up to the task are weeded out by these various wars and these struggles with other nations. When we are not at war, we must do that weeding ourselves. We must get rid of those who sort of can't hack it and who can't sort of hang with the program. Okay, which we're going to see particularly in Nazi Germany, but in most of the fascist states, is going to result in a great deal of government-sponsored violence. Okay, so the next question we need to pose is, why are these fascists gaining so much ground during this time? There are a couple of reasons. Number one, fear of communism. Right, obviously, with these continued worker strikes in these various countries, the looming presence of communist Russia, there is a great deal of fear about falling to communism, and so a lot of people who are on the right, who don't like communists, are going to be willing to support the fascists for that reason. Number two, most of Europe was, as we discussed, in the middle of an economic downturn. So a government that steps in to take control of the economy and push it in a specific direction that is going to further develop economic strength while at the same time taking care of the workers appealed to a lot of people. Number three, even though the notion of government control didn't appeal, big businesses generally supported these fascist regimes because they said, okay, these guys are all about capitalism, they're all about productivity. This is something that we ought to be able to get behind. We all want to be successful. Nobody wants us to be successful more than these fascists do because they want our country to be strong. We also have left over from World War I these remnants of nationalism, this sort of desire for greatness that is left over from the war that a lot of these fascists are going to play on. And particularly in areas where there's a lot of economic stability, also the fascists are promising some kind of sort of social stability as well. And so in these rough areas where there's a lot of worker strikes and the middle and upper classes are longing for that stability, for that firm government, somebody who can solve the problem, the fascists are going to attempt to provide that. And this movement is really going to begin in Italy. These fascists actually start appearing before World War I, but they don't really gain a lot of ground and a lot of notoriety until after the war. And after the war, basically, business owners and landowners are going to start finding these gangs of fascists, many of whom are veterans of the war who have now come back and because of the unemployment have nothing to do. And they are going to start supplying those gangs of fascists who are called black shirts with weapons in order to break strikes and sort of restore some kind of order. And we're actually going to see this kind of thing happening in a lot of countries. Keep in mind, of course, that as people are coming home from the war, production has dropped. People don't need all those tank shells and everything made anymore. So we have a lot fewer jobs available, and so for a lot of these soldiers who come home and can't get their job back at the such and such factory or on the such and such farm, they are they need something to do, and where better for them to use these military skills than in these gangs. So as these gangs are running around sort of beating up workers who are striking and causing trouble, one gentleman in particular is going to rise to prominence, and that is going to be a fellow by the name of Benito Mussolini. And he is going to become sort of the head of these fascist groups, and they have a lot of advantages. They have sort of big business money on their side. They have the support of several newspapers. They have a lot of sort of supporters. And Mussolini is going to advocate violent domination by the state. He says everything with the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So this is very much a big government, command economy type of policy. And he is arguing that Italy has a historic destiny to fulfill. We have to get back to the greatness of the Romans. It's our destiny to sort of turn the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. And in October 1922, Mussolini and other fascists are named to these cabinet posts after they sort of bully the king, Victor Emmanuel III, into posting them, because all the fascists are sort of rioting, and they say, listen, Victor Emmanuel, if you just put us into these cabinet positions, everything will calm down and everything will be fine. Well, then he becomes prime minister, and he convinces Parliament to give him the authority to rule by decree for a year, which, if you remember your Julius Caesar, this should start to sound very, very familiar. He then is able to either convince or bully enough people into voting for him the next time around that he takes control of the government and forces Victor Emmanuel to step down. He becomes known as Il Duce, meaning the leader. And the phrase Mussolini is always right gains wild popularity. And this, if you have any love for personal freedom and democracy, this should be terrifying you right now. Because as Natalie Portman's character in the third Star Wars, or the third new Star Wars film said, this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause, right? I mean, Mussolini was able to convince people that he was working in their best interests, and that the violence and the oppression was actually the best thing for Italy, right? So this is something that we ought to be keeping an eye on, because these are the sorts of issues that we continue to face into the modern day. Now, Mussolini is an example of how far you can get on charisma. He made very clever use of propaganda in newspapers. He was an excellent speech maker. He was, in fact, on the cover of Time magazine 8 separate times. Okay, so in many ways, he is a true, perhaps one of the first true modern politicians. He has a really good sense of the dramatic, and he is, sort of takes a couple of points and really nails them home and makes sure that his face is very recognizable, and that's how he gets people to vote for him. Okay, so again, this notion of mass politics, we're continuing to see that have a greater and greater impact when guys like him are able to effectively marshal that to get all these sad, upset, desperate people to sort of go along with him. He was known as very theatrical. He was called by the French papers the Carnival Caesar, and he had these images of himself taken, these photos of him being very youthful and vigorous, fencing and playing various sports and wearing all these military uniforms. And for any of those of you who are familiar with Vladimir Putin in Russia, this should also sound relatively familiar in terms of the way that he has used the press. So he took control of the Italian government, and he was essentially running everything more or less by himself. He was described at one point as an orchestra director who was trying to play all the instruments, and he would not allow anyone to disagree with him. He did, however, need the support of the Catholic Church in order to sort of solidify his control, because most of our Italians during this period are still Catholic, and he knew that sort of the Pope's endorsement would be crucial. So with that in mind, he kind of reversed the nationalist movement of the late 19th century in Italy, and he made the Vatican an independent enclave within Italy. So he gave the Pope political control of the Vatican and at the immediately sort of surrounding land there, just that few acres, however much it's on. He also allowed religious instruction to return to schools, and as a result, he gained a lot of support from the Pope. He was basically completely backed by the Catholic Church. He also had a lot of thugs and police beating up or killing political opponents. And he dreamed of one day having this 8 million man army, which, by the way, would have been about 1/5 of Italy's population. And I quote here, an air force that would blot out the sun. Okay, so very, very expansionistic, very militaristic. He also launched this pro-natal campaign to drive up the Italian birth rate, because for nationalists, we need to be strong, we need to have a lot of kids so that we can produce the next generation of workers and soldiers. He banned the use of contraceptives, which obviously made the Catholic Church happy. And he also put a tax on quote-unquote unjustified celibacy. And I haven't been able to track down exactly what that means, but I'm sure those of you who have something of a creative imagination can come up with something to go there. Now, in Germany, Germany is going to encounter fascism a little bit later. And we cannot talk about German fascism without referencing Adolf Hitler. Hitler was an Austrian by birth. He was born very close to the German border. He had dropped out of school. He had attempted to get into art school, but was not accepted. And so he basically spent most of his time living in Vienna painting postcards. There was a particularly strong vein of anti-Semitism going on in Viennese politics at the time, which he seems to have absorbed. He seems to have been a pretty interesting figure. There are reports that 2 women, while he was living in Vienna, actually committed suicide out of love for him. Not exactly sure what drove them to do so. Maybe it was this impeccably groomed mustache. Hard to say. So when World War I came along, he actually signed up for the German army, which, Austria and Germany were allies, so it was kind of 6-1, half a dozen the other. He was wounded in 1916, and later towards the end of the war, he suffered from a gas attack, and so he spent some time in hospital. He was decorated for bravery 3 times, but he was never promoted to be an officer because the German officers believed that he, quote unquote, lacked leadership skills, which is ironic. But World War I was sort of a watershed moment for Adolf Hitler. He felt very inspired by sort of the heroic nature of the struggle, and he very much came to believe, as did many Germans, that Germany had not lost the war, that Germany had basically fought the Allies to a standstill, and that they could theoretically have gone on fighting forever, which is not true, but that these secret enemies within and without Germany, Marxists and Jews, had conspired to sort of ruin Germany's chances at an honorable peace, and that there was this sort of vast international conspiracy that was plotting to sort of push Germany down. Now, certainly, Hitler was not the only gentleman in the German-speaking world to have these ideas. There are other sort of proto-fascists, like a gentleman named Oswald Spengler, who said, "There is no power of reason over life. New wars will destroy impotent democracies and bring new powerful leaders." And he wrote that in 1918, and he argued that, therefore, that a German race would come to sort of dominate the world. So in 1919, Hitler joined and then came to lead the National German Workers' Party, or the Nazis, as their Führer, or leader. He then started to seek rich and powerful friends so that they could get money for propaganda, for guns, and they started organizing stormtroopers, these right-wing, frustrated war veterans, kind of like the black shirts in Italy. And Hitler really appealed to them as a fellow soldier and as a man of action and as this tough guy who wanted to make Germany great again and undo that just evil Versailles peace. And they really started doing a lot of their organizing in Bavaria, and in particular in the city of Munich. And in Munich, they were all drinking at a beer hall one night in 1923, and they said, "You know what, guys? This is the time." So they went and sort of kidnapped some local officials and said, "Hey, we are going to march from Munich to Berlin, and we're going to take control of the government, and we're going to get rid of this Weimar Republic." Because remember, this is 1923, so this is at the height of the inflation and the misery and so forth. We're going to start up a new government, we're going to make Germany great again, and all this sort of stuff. And then these officials said, "Okay, we'll go with you, but we need to go home and change first." And so they immediately, because these guys allowed them to go, they take off and call the cops. And so as these Nazis start marching from this beer hall through the streets of Munich, they arrive to find that the police have sort of barricaded the streets, and a gunfight ensues. And in this gunfight, 16 Nazis, 3 policemen, and 1 waiter at a cafe who was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time are all killed. And after Hitler later came to power, he put up a memorial, a plaque on the side of a building at that spot that said, "Here, 20 brave Nazis died for their fatherland." And some people said, "Well, wasn't it 16 Nazis and 3 police officers who were shooting at the Nazis and one guy who was just kind of there?" And he says, "Well, they were all Nazis at heart. They had just been led astray." And so then he actually starts making, he passed a law that said that when good German citizens passed by this plaque, they had to stop and salute it, do the whole sort of Sieg Heil thing and all that sort of stuff. And people who opposed Nazism started sneaking off down this alley in order to avoid that particular spot. And this is the alley here as it looks today. And eventually, right down here, they started posting Gestapo. And if you came down the alley, sort of like skipped out going and saluting the monument, then they would sort of throw you in a police car and shuffle you off to a concentration camp. And so this is actually the memorial that the citizens of Munich have erected. This I guess this little sort of path of silver cobblestones that shows the path that the people who opposed Hitler took. So yes, so obviously the beer hall push failed, and Hitler, for his part in it, was sent to jail for 5 years. But because the judge was somewhat sympathetic and they were concerned about a whole bunch of rioting if he was punished really badly, they basically sent him to Club Med jail. It was very, very nice. He was allowed to write. He had really a pretty comfortable room. And while he was there, he wrote Mein Kampf, his book, which means My Struggle. And in Mein Kampf, he articulated a couple of ideas. First of all, Germany was stabbed in the back by the Jews and the communists. And again, he was not the only person in Germany who said this. President Hindenburg of the Weimar Republic had actually said the same thing. He also said our working classes were sort of suffering and dying at the front while these betrayers were sort of hiding out, collaborating against us. So again, if you were a frustrated soldier or a worker who had been starving during the war, this is the kind of thing that may have in some way appealed to you. He also argued that Germany should rearm, reestablish its army, and then conquer new living space, which in German is called Lebensraum. And that living space should be conquered in Eastern and Southern Europe at the expense of these sort of inferior Slavic peoples, like the Serbs and the Russians and so forth and so on. Now, he did eventually get out of jail. He continued his work. And he said, all right, you know what, the whole coup thing didn't go over so well, so maybe we should pursue legal means to power. So he starts doing a lot of propaganda to have him portrayed, much as Mussolini was, this energetic, devoted, deeply religious guy who was committed, who was a self-made man, who fought in the trenches honorably for his country and all that sort of stuff. And on paper, he really looked, politically, he looked pretty good, right? So Hitler then basically is offering the people of Germany a solution. And again, during this period of the 20s, when they're upset, they feel like Germany has been, beaten down by the Allies in the war settlement. There's all this rapid hyperinflation. Nobody has a job. It is easy to see how his message could have appealed to some people. Now, into this particular moment in history comes October of 1929. And in October of 1929, we have some major economic trouble. First of all, much of the civilized world, quote unquote, is already kind of in a recession. There's falling demand for war materials and coal. The war had encouraged agricultural overproduction, which was no longer needed, so prices are dropping. The political instability in these former empires is dampening trade, and there's increasingly speculative stock trading. This should remind us both of the South Sea bubble and of 2008. So that is to say, these companies are paying out or are selling so much stock that they cannot pay off the dividends to their stockholders. And the stocks are really not worth anywhere near as much as people are being led to believe. And so in 1929, the stock market finally crashes. And it ruins a lot of people. A lot of people lose their fortunes. A lot of people had everything in stock instead of in some kind of a savings account or anything, because they said, these stocks just keep going up and up and up and up and up. It's a sure thing in terms of uh, making sure that our money is going to be sort of working for us the way we want. And so the Roaring Twenties are going to give way to the Great Depression and the so-called threadbare 30s. So, um, as with all recessions, it's very difficult for these welfare states to deal with the fact that simultaneously we have a decrease in tax revenue because the size of our economy is shrinking, but also we have more people who need these benefits that we're supposed to provide, such as the the welfare, the unemployment insurance, and pensions, and so forth and so on. Okay, and again, this is something that we continue to deal with in the United States even now. It was one of the major issues in the last election, and what's going to be done with Social Security reform is probably one of the big issues of the next several presidential terms as well. Now, Britain suffers from this big time. Okay, and we can see here the 1928 unemployment rate basically more than doubles in 1930 or by 1932, and by 1934 it really hasn't come down all that much. Okay, so Britain is in big trouble. Their currency is fluctuating wildly. They have to go off the gold standard. It's really bad. And at this point, the Tories are voted back in, and they're being led by this sort of dowdy gentleman named Neville Chamberlain. There's even a small fascist movement in England that springs up that's supported by Hitler and Mussolini, but it never really gains a lot of ground. Now you'll notice that the French are less badly off than everybody else is, and that's largely because their economy was a little bit more local. Unlike the British, they don't have their economy connected to this vast empire and everything. So, as long as the guy, 2 streets over still wants to buy your eggs, you're more or less okay. And in addition, France has some very, very large gold reserves that they're able to fall back on to sort of make sure things keep running smoothly. But eventually, it's going to start to affect their currency too. We talked about the fact that in 1924, they're having some pretty serious economic trouble. So how do we deal with all this? What do we do? Well, conventional wisdom was based on what today we call Austrian economics. That is, we need to cut spending, we need to cut unemployment benefits, we need to restrict credit. And by sort of stopping ourselves from bleeding money, the economy will eventually sort of naturally recover on its own. Okay, this is a philosophy, of course, that in the most recent sort of several political elections has been espoused by the Republican Party, for those of you that keep up with that sort of thing. However, there's this British economist who I've already mentioned named John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes is going to say, no, what we need to do when we're in a recession is we need to spend our way out. The government should stimulate the economy by funding public works projects and providing jobs and unemployment benefits and like getting people spending again, and that's ultimately what is going to get us out. Now, the flip side of that, obviously, is that in order to do so, you're going to have to borrow more money and take on more debt. Okay, which again is that is a philosophy that has generally in 2008, 2012 was has been put forth by the Democratic Party in the United States. So if that gives you any sense of grounding in the modern era. And so Keynes is going to say what we need to do is we've got to spend our way out. And initially, nobody's much going to listen to him, and it's not really until the 30s, like 34, 35, that people are going to start trying this. And it is going to help some. Roosevelt in America in particular is going to put out his New Deal program, in which he's going to create things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and some other sort of civil work programs to try and spend and get people back to work and increase infrastructure and all that sort of thing. And when he put this out, Keynes said he was marvelously right. Like finally somebody's doing the right thing, and one of his friends quipped, well, actually he's marvelously left, because obviously this notion of the government spending its way out of a recession was a very liberal sort of leftist philosophy at the time. Again, big government involvement, that kind of thing. During this period, we also see the French legislate a 40-hour work week, and they start to put in some pay raises and paid vacation, which continues in France to this day and is a major feature of the welfare state there. However, in most of Europe, these economic troubles are going to sort of fuel the growth of fascism and dictatorship. These promises of solutions that the fascists are going to provide to these economic problems, in tandem with, we're going to not only send you back to work, but we're also going to protect you from those evil communists and from those labor unions that are causing all this trouble. And the fascists are going to argue, you know what? If this era has demonstrated anything, it is that democracy is too slow and too clumsy. There's too many situations where it's just a whole bunch of elected officials kind of barking at each other and not getting anything done, which I'm sure those of you, again, who are politically aware, is a similar complaint that we sometimes hear about our own government in the United States. And so therefore these fascists are going to argue what we need to do is we need to put one guy in charge who we believe in and who we trust, and he will do better for us than democracy will. We need one strong leading voice to direct us. And so during this period, obviously, Hitler and Mussolini are gaining strength in Germany and Italy, respectively, despite the fact that in many cases they're banning unions and breaking strikes and sort of working against the lower classes. Mussolini, in fact, is basically ruining Italy's economy by changing things that don't need to be changed and not changing what did. He's making a lot of the industries real inefficient. He's trying some land reclamation projects that are very ineffective. He is converting the economy, or converting agricultural land to grow less labor-intensive crops that are actually increasing unemployment. But at the same time, he's making no effort to solve the illiteracy problems in southern Italy. He's not really finding ways to meaningfully increase the country's GDP, which was way, way, way behind countries like America and Britain. In some cases, about 80 to 100 years behind developmentally. So, long story short, with the exception of Scandinavia and the Czech Republic and France and Britain, pretty much everywhere else in Europe has some kind of dictatorship by the time we get to about 1938. Obviously, in the Soviet Union, we're looking at a communist dictatorship that's being run by Joseph Stalin, and fascist regimes in Central Europe and also in Spain. So it kind of depends on where you're looking. But either way, democracy is being pushed out in favor of the guy who can offer us the quick solution. Okay. In France, that sort of development of a fascist dictatorship is going to be blocked by this sort of popular leftist coalition where all the socialists and communists and liberals are going to get together and say, okay, you know what, I know we don't agree, but let's band together so that we can keep these crazies out of the government. And Britain, historically, really since the Civil War, has kind of just stayed away from really radical government, right? The British are kind of, they're into, you know what, let's ride this thing out. Let's let it stay stable and so forth and so on. So the problem that we're running into is these fascists have these very expansionist philosophies, and they're engendering a lot of political chaos. And those expansionist policies are going to be in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and that's going to be the big problem that we're about to start running into. Meanwhile, of course, these fascists are taking really direct control of their societies, not just politically, but also in terms of private life. And it starts with Il Duce. He's going to advocate a program to control human morality in tandem with the Catholic Church, and say we're going to sort of espouse the values of the state. We need to get women back into the home and out of the workforce. Child rearing needs to be this national duty, which is kind of ironic because in a traditional show of Italian government ineffectiveness, the birth rate in Italy is actually going to fall despite Il Duce trying all these things to sort of beef it up. Okay, frankly, fascism in Germany is always going to be a lot more successful than fascism in Italy is ever going to be. And nowhere is this going to be more apparent than in looking at the career of the two leaders. It took Benito Mussolini about 3 years from the time that he really got involved in politics to sort of solidify his control over the state, it's going to take Adolf Hitler about 3 months. Okay, so in Germany in the 30s, the ranks of the Nazi Party were swelled by the economic hardship that was engendered by the Great Depression. In 1928, the Nazi Party got 3% of the vote in the election. In 1930, they got 18%. Okay, so this is an enormous increase in their political power. Now, President Hindenburg, who you see pictured here, who had been a World War I general, he was the guy who defeated the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg, or one of the guys. In 1930, as things are getting really bad, he starts ruling by decree, but things keep getting worse, and his government basically resigns on him. Hitler runs against Hindenburg for president and manages to get 13.5 million votes to Hindenburg's 19 million. So already enormous political support that he's developing, even as early as 1930. At this point, support for the Weimar Republic basically just starts to erode and collapse on both the right and the left. And some generals start advocating for a military dictatorship. And what they say is, okay, here's what we want to do. We've got the army. We don't have the political machinery that we need to make this happen. So what we need to do is we need to form a partnership with the Nazis. We're going to use them to help us get control of the political establishment and establish this military dictatorship, and then we're going to push the Nazis out. Okay, and so in order to accomplish that, they actually make Hitler the chancellor of Germany. So he's basically one of the most powerful individuals in the government underneath President Hindenburg. And everything really gets thrown into confusion on February 3rd, 1933, when there is a fire at the Reichstag in Berlin. Okay, which is pictured here. This is obviously during the fire. This is during the aftermath of World War II. Okay, so there's a fire at the Reichstag, and the fire is blamed on the communists. And in fact, they go and arrest and pin the fire on a Dutch hobo, of all things, a homeless Dutch man who supposedly was a communist. In reality, it was probably somebody in the government, either one of these military coup guys, or it could have been somebody in the Nazi Party as well. Hitler, in the aftermath of this, is able to convince the Reichstag to, trust me to root out the plot. They let him suspend human rights. They let him create a special Nazi police force, which will eventually become the Gestapo. Then, in March, we have a new series of elections. Remember, this is 1 month after the fire. Hitler gets 44% of the vote. And then he has the Reichstag give him unlimited emergency powers. So at this point, suddenly, Hitler has basically 180'd all the guys who thought they were using him, and now it turns out he was using them. In June, Hitler bans all political parties except the Nazis, creates a new state-run labor organization to replace the unions that he also outlawed, and disbands all the local parliaments, taking full control of the country. Hindenburg finally dies in August of 1934, and after that, Hitler is the only person with any power in Germany. Okay, so in the period of about 3 months, he goes from being this guy who had kind of been put into this post just to sort of have somewhere to put him, to running Germany. So characteristics of this Nazi regime. Okay, number one, unlimited police power. The Gestapo and the SS, who were Hitler's personal bodyguard, actually turn on the Nazi stormtroopers that he created and killed many of them in June of 1934, what's called the Night of the Long Knives, because they had become too powerful and they were seen as a danger to the state now that they actually were running the government. They were too unpredictable. Also, complete control of non-government life. Organizations like the Hitler Youth, which you see pictured here, and other sort of sports clubs, university organizations are all controlled by the Nazi Party and are used as ways to sort of indoctrinate the sort of next generation of Germans. There are also schools that are controlled by the party, and we'll take a little look at some of this in class. They have new textbooks, they have new courses, all of which are meant to sort of put forward this new sort of Nazi notion of German nationalism and so forth. So they take courses like Teutonic prehistory and that kind of thing. And again, something to keep in mind as you all are becoming citizens of the world, controlling the educational system is one of the number one ways that someone is able to control a society. Because obviously, if you can influence the way people think, you can profoundly influence the way that they in turn are going to act. And this is a system, obviously, an educational system that discourages intellectualism, discourages questioning, and encourages this sort of unflagging loyalty to the state and to the Fuhrer. This is also a society where we have a great deal of family controls. Children are encouraged to out their parents if they do anything non-loyal. We have these Aryan breeding programs to encourage people with this so-called Aryan blood to produce children even outside of wedlock. So yes, we know you have your husband and you have your wife, but just get together and have a kid for the sake of the fatherland, right? Which is kind of ironic given the importance that they're going to place on sort of the family unit as the building block of German greatness. Women are given incentives to stay home and to have children, and are then in turn excluded from many professions to sort of encourage them to do so. There's also a really strong sense of community that is developing. The Nazis are encouraging participation in their rallies and encouraging people to come hear these speeches. The rhetoric is associated with sort of struggle and commitment and service to the community, which is sort of I guess, the more socialist side of this fascist philosophy. This notion of Aryanism also comes to be highly touted. And that is the notion that this race of Aryans, which you will recall them from when we were talking about the introduction of Hinduism, this supposed light-skinned race from somewhere in Central Eurasia. Hitler believed, and the Nazi Party believed, that Germans were sort of the ultimate descendants of this race of sort of white supermen, the Aryans, and so that's where that notion comes from. Make sure you do not confuse it with Aryan Christianity. They are two different things. There's also a great deal of artistic control by the Nazi regime. They burn books. Anything that's written by a Jew or a communist or somebody else who didn't agree with the party, they would get together and burn, which included a lot of sort of Enlightenment works. They did the same thing for art and music. If it didn't fit with the Nazi vision, it was gotten rid of. Even some classic German composers like Mendelssohn, for example, because he was Jewish. All of his work is banned. Richard Wagner, on the other hand, who we also discussed was a pretty vehement anti-Semite, does real well in Nazi Germany. Okay. They also attack the sort of hedonistic Roaring Twenties lifestyle. They start closing down a lot of the nightclubs and that sort of thing, which if any of you have ever seen either the play or the film musical Cabaret, that is one of the things that Cabaret is sort of about. There's also a gentleman named Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Hitler, and he also sort of took control of the film industry and encouraged the production of films that he felt were appropriately German in their subject matter and their themes and that kind of thing. So there's this sort of Nazi film industry as well. And they start banning films from other countries that do not conform to those ideals, which eventually is going to be one of the reasons that Hollywood is really going to turn on Nazi Germany and really get involved in the American sort of counter-propaganda war. There's also a new economic policy, and that policy is recovery through rearmament. This is a period during which the German army is sort of beefing up or trying anyway, through what's called the 4-year plan, started in 1936, to beef up their steel, iron, rubber and fuel industries to eventually support the creation of a larger war machine. It's also coincidentally, since we're putting this government spending into all of these industries, we're providing jobs, we're putting people back to work. So this is an example of a right-wing version of that sort of Keynesian economic theory. There are also some public works projects. For example, the Autobahn, or pardon me, the Autobahn is started by the Nazis during this period. We're building highways, both for civilian and eventually military transport. The problem is that the non-military industries that are not being supported by the state kind of stagnate here. And further, Germany, of course, is still very dependent on imports of raw materials like copper and rubber and bauxite, especially since some of its best industrial areas are still being occupied by the French. There's also a great deal of anti-Semitism during this period, and we're going to look at all of these things in class, so I'm not showing us a lot of propaganda here. We'll see plenty more when we look at this in class. Partially, that anti-Semitism is being motivated by this Aryan philosophy, this notion that Germans are somehow superior to Jewish people, naturally, it's sort of social Darwinism, but also by this theory of the Versailles conspiracy that Jews and communists are somehow responsible for all of Germany's problems. And this is really capped off by a couple of things. One, the 1935 Nuremberg laws, which deprive Jews of citizenship and require them to wear the Star of David when they travel out of the house. No marriage or sexual contact is allowed between Jews and non-Jews. They are excluded from certain professions, and eventually they're going to be forced to turn over most of their assets to Gentiles. Many Jews, the second Hitler comes to power, immigrate from Germany and move into other parts of Europe, or in some cases to the Americas. Then it's going to get worse. In 1938, after the attack, well, actually the murder, I should say, of a German official in Paris by a Jew, the Nazis are going to orchestrate a simultaneous attack on thousands and thousands of Jewish homes and businesses in Germany on November the 9th, 1938. This is called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. They killed hundreds of Jews. They beat up thousands more. They wrecked their businesses. It was really a pretty horrible experience, and of course, it's all government sponsored. Now, Nazi foreign policy, and no, of course, pause, but no, of course, that we will come back to the anti-Semitism when we look at the Holocaust. Okay, so that's just this is just sort of an initial sort of capstone for that. Foreign policy in the Nazi regime. One, we need to get rid of the Versailles Treaty. Two, we need to obtain this Lebensraum, this living space, by annexing the territory of these inferior peoples so that we can get more production and we can take on their citizens eventually as slaves. We need to be unified with the other Germanic territories like Austria, like the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia by annexing them. Also, we need to develop a friendship with fascist Italy. And perhaps most importantly, we need to rearm. And to that end, Hitler worked out deals to get some sort of secret weapons and training from Italy as he was redeveloping the German military. So we are now in the late 30s, and we are beginning to get close to a new war. It's going to start with Italy in a lot of ways. Italy, again, there's that vision of we're going to expand, we're going to rule the former Roman Empire in the Mediterranean again. They start with an invasion of Albania and Libya, and an invasion of Ethiopia, and this time their invasion of Ethiopia is actually going to succeed. And this does a couple of things. First of all, it demonstrates that League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson established to try and stop these things from happening was completely ineffective, particularly without the support of the United States or Russia. They try to put some sanctions on Italy, but they're pretty weak. The sanctions don't include oil, and they still allow Italy to use the Suez Canal, so it basically doesn't do anything. It also demonstrates that Britain and France are not willing to get involved in another war, not only because they're still sort of tired of fighting, from the last war, but moreover that they're hoping, because they're beginning to recognize that Germany is going to become dangerous, they were still hoping that Mussolini would help them to sort of slow down Hitler when and where it was required, and therefore they did not want to stop Mussolini from taking these territories here because they didn't want to push him closer to an alliance with Hitler. Meanwhile, Germany is also beginning to make some rather aggressive expansionist moves. Okay, number one, Germany is going to occupy the Rhineland demilitarized zone, and the French are basically just going to let them do it. Germany then announces that they are rearming and that they are bumping their number of soldiers from 100,000 up to 1/2 They institute a draft, they rebuild their air force, and they sign a separate pact with Britain to allow them to maintain a larger navy. They're still significantly smaller than the British, but a larger navy than the Versailles Treaty had allowed. 1938. Germany's military spending is 52% of its national budget and 17% of its GDP. So this is a huge, huge growth. As they're rearming, they're taking advantage of this to beef up their tech. So they're not just like building more copies of World War I technology. We're starting to use faster, better tanks. We're developing all-metal airplanes that can move at much higher speeds. We are also developing FM radio so that we can communicate from tank to tank. And they also develop a throat microphone that attaches around your neck that picks up directly on the vibrations from your vocal cords, so that if you are in a plane or a tank and you're talking, you're not picking up the sort of ambient noise of the engines and the guns being fired and that sort of thing. You can actually hear each other much better. It's pretty brilliant scientific stuff that's being done in Germany during this period, and we'll look at that more when we look at the war. There's also the Anschluss, in which they annex Austria in 1938. So Austria becomes part of this Nazi Germany, this Third Reich. And then they start looking at taking control of parts of Czechoslovakia that were largely ethnically German. This region that's called the Sudetenland. Okay. Now, Hitler wanted it, and he told everybody that he wanted it. He says, "You guys, I'm going to annex this territory." Now, that was a problem because Czechoslovakia was being protected under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, and Great Britain and France were supposed to step in and honor that if required. So the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, walks in. He goes to a conference in Munich in 1938 and says, "Okay, let's make a deal. Hitler, we will give you the Sudetenland if you promise that this is it, that there's going to be no more after this. You're not going to do any more annexing." Hitler says, "Oh, okay, fine, sure." So they totally sell out Czechoslovakia and just give up the Sudetenland. And they even, the British government even allows the Nazis to use some British banks to transfer assets from Czechoslovakia to Germany, which they weren't supposed to do. And this is a policy, this policy of sort of like giving in to Hitler was called appeasement. And Neville Chamberlain said, "You know what? We know it sucks. It's not what anybody wanted, but this will lead to peace in our time. And we've got to do what we need to do to keep peace, because we don't want another war." Okay. And meanwhile, Hitler is kind of walking around laughing at these guys, going, "God, what a bunch of dopes." And then in 1939, he just goes on and occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia and starts announcing his intentions to get back some of this territory that Germany had been forced to give up to form Poland. Now, meanwhile, in Spain, we have a civil war going on. The very ineffectual king Alfonso XIII abdicates in 1931. They attempt to establish a sort of leftist republic, but they also are dealing with this really remarkable rise of these sort of fascist groups in Spain who are causing a lot of trouble and beating people up and all that sort of thing. And they're being aided by the Germans and the Italians. And so in 1936, they actually start an insurgency that's being led by General Francisco Franco. Now, the Germans and the Italians, but mostly the Germans, take advantage of this civil war, and they use Spain as a testing ground for all of these new weapons that they had been developing. So they send over the new planes, the new tanks, secretly, of course, and allow the fascists in Spain to use them to fight the sort of the communists and the leftists, the loyalists. And in so doing, the Germans basically get the chance to watch and experiment with a whole bunch of new tactics that they've been considering, so that when they fight the next war, they won't run into the same problem they had before. Well, we're still using the same tactics, but we've got all these new weapons, and all of our men are going to get killed. And that's going to be really, really important when we talk about World War II. We'll get to that in a moment. There is also some aid coming the other way. The USSR, despite the fact that it has a non-aggression pact with Germany at this time, is sending some weapons and money to the loyalists, many of whom were communists. And this is a very brutal form of warfare that is being had. There's a lot of killing of civilians, there's a lot of executions, and that Pablo Picasso painting Guernica that we looked at is actually about the bombing of a Basque town. And you can see it's a lot of urban warfare. You see these guys are using piled up dead horses as a barrier. This is Francisco Franco, by the way. So the Loyalists were basically an ineffective coalition despite the influx of foreign volunteers from Britain and America. There was actually a brigade of troops called the Abe Lincoln Brigade who fought. They were all Americans that fought for the Loyalists. Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell, authors, both fought in the Spanish Civil War. But eventually, because the nationalists have access to all of these planes from the Nazis, they're able to dominate the skies and turn the tide. And by 1939, General Franco has won the war. Meanwhile, Japan has a new emperor named Hirohito, and they have also become extremely militaristic, extremely nationalistic. They invade Manchuria in 1931 to sort of expand their empire and get more raw materials. They invade China proper in 1937. We already talked about how that influenced the Chinese Civil War. And about this time, the Axis is formed. Italy, Germany, and Japan sign these military treaties together. And at this point, everybody knows a war is coming. Like 1937, 38, 39, we know there's going to be a war. So at this point, Britain and France start preparing. Britain starts cranking out fighter aircraft and sort of trying to build back up its army. France, meanwhile, builds a series of defenses along the German border that are called the Maginot Line. Joseph Stalin in Russia, signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler and agrees that if Hitler does invade Germany, that Stalin will invade as well, and that they will divide Poland between them. And on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and World War II in Europe officially is going to begin. I appreciate you guys bearing with me through this very long podcast. I will be back with you sometime soon with a new topic. Thanks for sticking with it. Bye.